After June 17, 2015, Herb Frazier, Marjory Wentworth, and Dr. Bernard Powers put their pain to writing with We Are Charleston. In this special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I sit down with all three of them, one-on-one. Well, the 12 days of the victory in the Valley has ended. Frazier, I want to take it back because obviously you used to be a former newspaper reporter and a writer. Mm-hmm. If you were to write a headline right now about the 12 days of the victory in the Valley, what would the headline be right now?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think about it. Well, I guess one of the things will come out of what all of we've been talking about is forgive but don't forget. Mm-hmm. We know, looking at this backwards now, a year down the road, we know what the power of forgiveness is. We know that the forgiveness by some of the family members, what this has done to elevate the story on a global stage. But we know that forgiveness does not necessarily mean that it's a sign of weakness. Right. We must not forget. Not only must we not forget those who lost their lives, mm-hmm. we must not forget those who survived, right. But we must also remember that there's a lot of work yet to do, even though the flag is down. Right. And we must continue this dialogue. So forgive, but don't forget, mm-hmm. and keep talking.
And Marjory, obviously you're a court laureate for our state. I'm wondering, what would the poem be right now?
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking we could go with that title.
Okay,
Forgive,
cool.
but don't forget.
Okay.
I like that. I mean, I think, that's really what, getting back to your original question, sure. I mean, I think that's what all this series of events were about to a certain extent. And there were a lot of them, right. But I'm guessing that the idea behind that was something for everybody, yeah. Particularly the congregation, right. And certainly the families, but then, different events that someone who might not, go to church, but could still participate in the march, sure. Or something like that. So I think the idea was to create something for the whole community as well. And that's kind of hard to balance that. So I guess forgive but don't forget. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I keep thinking that it's a teaching moment. Sure. And we've had time to reflect. I think the grief is still unbearable. Mm. The trials are coming up, and it's going to bring all that up. And so it's really important that we support the families and the congregation, who's now there's another minister, so that the church is still resurrecting itself as well,
And let me pause for just a second, because you just mentioned that. Obviously, Dr. Betty D. Clark was moved to Georgetown, and now you have Dr. Eric Manning, who was from Bethel AME in Georgetown. How will that affect the church going forward?
Well, I think it's uncertain. It's uncertain what led to the move, what the consequences will be. Right. We don't know what experiences the new minister will bring. The congregation will have to get to know him. He'll have to get to know his new right. flock and provide them with guidance. So as I listened to what Herb and Marjory said, right. My thought was, this is a congregation that is still on a journey. It's still in the wilderness, trying to reach the promised land. Mm-hmm. And so the new minister now hopefully will be able to guide them and to take them over into the new promised land, whatever that portends for the congregation. And we hope that congregation will be in the future as it has been in the past, one that is increasingly strong, resilient, mm-hmm. and forward-looking.
Speaking of which, when I read this somewhere, but you basically said, Dr. Powers, that We Are Charleston was basically written to talk about how Mother Emanuel, that is, has really dealt with tragedy after tragedy.
That's right.
Talk to me more about that.
Sure. Well, we can think of the congregation itself in its initial inception as having developed in and around tragedy and hostility persecution, because that congregation, which begins during the slave era, was really a revolutionary congregation when you think about it, because the AME church was an abolitionist church, created in the midst of a slaveholding society. This is unprecedented in the South during this time period, and so such a congregation could never get the approval of the authorities. That never happened. But what did happen was persecution, jailings, and ultimately the destruction of the church before the Civil War. Then, of course, after the Civil War, the congregation manages to reappear. Those people who remained around from the original congregation, they come back together, and then they meet the challenges of the new era of emancipation. And there were many such challenges. And then, of course, we know in the late 19th century, there was the physical challenge brought about by the earthquake of 1886, which destroyed a considerable amount of the city, and Emmanuel suffered considerable damage at that point also. But nevertheless, we see the congregation coming together, pooling its resources, sacrificing, constructing a new building to really consecrate a new day and a new set of efforts. And we are today blessed with the congregation that we have on Calhoun Street.
Speaking of Calhoun Street, Herb, I understand that obviously you went to Mother Emanuel for 14 years of your life. And I read somewhere that you basically said during that time, you know, Mother Emanuel was really the gateway for African American people from Calhoun Street actually down to Concord.
Yes, the neighborhood immediately surrounding the neighborhood was a predominantly black neighborhood.
Right.
Ansonboro, or as local people would say, the borough.
Right.
And the service that the church provided to the community in a number of ways, not only just church services on Sunday, but also youth programs for children in the neighborhood, is part of what Dr. Powers writes about in the book, is that in the AME tradition, it is important for the church and the ministers of the church to not only meet the spiritual needs of the members of the church, but also the physical needs of the members of the church and the community. So we thought it was important to also talk about that. And also in the book, we talk about some of the reminders of the slave era, and also the Confederacy. Calhoun Street being the most prominent one of them, but also one when it was important to also note that even within the community, the immediate community, the church is right down the street from Gadsden's Wharf.
Right.
And my old neighborhood, Lawrence Street, is bounded in the southern part of that part of Ansonboro, named for Henry Lawrence, a slave trader. So, and then also for me, it was sort of like a trip down memory lane to talk about my childhood there. I don't want to sound too overly romantic with it, but it was a kind of an idyllic city or portion of the city in which I lived, because there weren't too many white faces that came to that part of the city, and it was almost like the saying we have today, it takes a village to raise a child. Mm-hmm. It was sort of like the neighbor, the adults in the community had some authority to correct you, and I think out of that, and then coupled with the View School being across the street, we had these two institutions side by side that anchored that community, and it was a very strong community. Not to say, because I'm looking at it as a child, I guess I had very naive eyes, sense of the adult world, but for me it was a very sort of safe place to live. We had fights, like any kids, we had fights, but they didn't lead to the consequences that you see today. But there again, it was a good nurturing environment, and when you moved out of that environment, then you started to see that that some of the things, the lessons that you learned in that community, in that church, in that school, equipped you for the world outside of the neighborhood.
Marjorie, what did We Are Charleston teach you?
Oh, wow. Well, that we'd have to stay most of the day to go through that list. Well, one of the first things that was really surprising, we were doing research about, for the chapter, the sin of slavery, and trying to give the sense of how it was here from the very beginning. And to find out that there were slave ships in my hometown in Massachusetts, New England acts sort of like it wasn't there. And it certainly was there. And I asked my mom about it. I said, "Did you know that they used to bring Africans into, because it was a harbor town,
Right.
She said, "Oh yeah, you and your brother used to play in those slave tunnels." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And there were these little tunnels on the harbor. And I, one of those things you don't even think about it. You play when you were little, and no one ever sealed them up, but they were kind of in the rocks. And apparently there must, I don't know, I haven't had time to go back and do the research, but there must have been times where they came in and no one was, they weren't supposed to be there because it was sort of hidden. So that was one of the first things. And I know that, for example, the state of Rhode Island has kind of had what we would call a come to Jesus with their history of slavery. I mean, he knows more about this, but many of the ships were owned by Rhode Island families. And then, I grew up around all these mill towns, different than here, but we don't think about just the economic impact. And if you were, making cloth in a mill town in Lowell, Massachusetts, so where do you think that cotton came from? And even beyond that, just the global impact of cotton and rice in terms of the world economy. I'm not saying I didn't know that, but I never thought about it. So that was that was a huge surprise. And I think the other piece of it that I haven't talked about, but because of the book, all of us, but we've been at many of the events this year. Right from the get-go, all kinds of people coming through and talking to us, and writers and media and what have you. And often I would be in the room, and just to hear the collective grief coming out of people of all ages in the African American community, just the wounds of, what do you call it, the microaggressions? That happen all the time, in big and small ways. And I would think to myself, this information doesn't get out into the world in a way that it needs to. The thing that really affected me was when Pharrell was here with Soledad O'Brien, and we were at a Mother Emanuel. I think they were filming.
Yes.
And here we are upstairs from the basement where this horrific crime occurred. But the pain was coming from events that had happened over the years to people in the African American community, from a junior high girl to a medical student, young man with kids who talked about no matter how much he accomplished, no matter what he did, he walked out the door and the cops looked at him as an African American guy and a troublemaker. And I'm kind of generalizing here, but I don't think there was a dry eye in the house over the. I don't know if were you guys there? I don't remember.
I wasn't.
And I thought, here we are, right upstairs from what happened, but the pain is coming from all these other situations, and there were people just across the spectrum. There was a lawyer, there was a judge, there was a junior high kid, and the problem is, what do you do with that, and where does that pain go? And I felt like it's got to leave this room and get out there. And I always think we need like our own truth and reconciliation committees here. I mean, I know right now they're having these hearings in North Charleston, anyway. So I feel like it's been almost like a privilege to be hearing this information over and over again. But it's also, my responsibility to find a way to let people know that this happens all the time, and I think a lot of people, a lot of white people, are insulated from it.
Dr. Powers, where does the pain go from here?
Well, we hope that it's going to be sublimated and redirected into some positive initiatives, and we have seen some of those things happen already. For example, Reverend Clark recently went down to Orlando to take a message of healing and comfort down to the recent victims of hate-inspired violence there in that community. We've also seen, for example, some initiatives take birth in and around that congregation as the base for initiatives designed to bring about more sensible gun-related legislation, so that we can more certainly prevent and reduce the access to weapons and weapons of mass destruction of the kind that have been used so frequently to destroy human life in this country. And so, for example, there's a very important organization here in the state by the name of Gun Sense, which is doing some very important work in that regard. And so we know that some of the people directly and indirectly affected by what happened at Emmanuel are very much involved in that kind of initiative. We've seen congressmen take some unprecedented actions here in recent days, and we've also seen some Republicans who typically have been the arch enemies of, at least in recent years, the arch enemies for more restrictive legislation begin to soften a bit. So I think this is perhaps a unique time period, certainly a period of which we've not seen in recent years.
You just handed me the bracelet that basically says this: only love can conquer hate, and obviously has the names of all of the victims who passed away. Now describe to me the following one word: Clemente.
Well, I hear that word and I immediately think of the pastor, Clemente Pinckney, a man who embodied the spirit of the AME denomination, who used his position in the Senate to advocate for those less fortunate in South Carolina, but also a very strong voice within the church. And you, being a young man, can appreciate that one of the things, he was a relatively young man too. He connected with the young people in the church. He was a hip, good dude, you know. He Snapchat, he did selfies, and one of the things we learned in talking to people, he loved fashion. He loved socks, colorful socks, and we tried to, in the book, we tried to humanize and bring and add voice to all of the people that lost their lives, and as we tried to also do the same with those who survived that night. So this bracelet grows out of Alana.
No. Well,
the expression.
No. Well, here's a woman named Lynn Axon started ordering these bracelets, and the only love can conquer hate was the epigraph I used on a poem, Holy City, and I got that from like a speech he gave. I think it was something it was soon after Walter Scott was killed. And I used it in the poem, and so she was just making these bracelets and sending them out with my poem, Holy City, and someone said, ooh, you kind of got to, I think there's copyright laws, you better check with the poet. So she emailed me, and she said, I'm sending out about 3,000 copies of your poem with these bracelets. I said, great, go crazy. I mean, what a beautiful thing. And she kept doing that, and then she packaged them up in these beautiful envelopes and sent these 3 big boxes to me so that I could just bring them and give them out at some of the events we've been doing. And at some point, she sent me an email, and it said, she signed it, she said, doing nothing is no longer an option. And I've never met her. She's not from Charleston. She's from a little town in South Carolina. I want to say she's from North, but I'm not 100% sure. And that's the kind of goodness that for all the horror, that's happened, there are people, really good people who want to do something, and this is something she could do.
Describe to me the following one word: Cynthia.
Oh, well, we're in a perfect setting to
Yes.
discuss
Right.
Cynthia, because here we are at Edelstone Library at the College of Charleston. I knew Cynthia just a little bit. I didn't know her that well. Where I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, I met Cynthia through an event that we have at Magnolia called the History Fair, and we wanted the Dart Library to come present during the event, because it's a historic library in the African American community. And she came, and I didn't know at the time, I didn't learn later until that she was a member of Emmanuel.
That's right.
And was very well connected with some of my friends who are still at Emmanuel. But Marjory knows her family very well. Her brother, Malcolm,
Right.
who is one of those individuals who have not extended forgiveness to the
Right.
shooter. And because this whole idea of forgiveness, of course, is not that simple. It's a very complicated process, and each person goes through that process at their own pace. So Cynthia is very, and also Cynthia is a very multi-talented person too. She was a mathematician.
Right.
She studied math in college. She is handy with her hands. We talk about in the book how she helped to decorate and renovate one of her colleagues and friends, the home of one of her colleagues and friends. So, and she was also a very special person, obviously, within her family.
One word to describe Taiwanza.
I'll let the poet do that, because
Oh,
he was a poet.
he was a spoken word poet and worked as a barber and entrepreneur. Of course,
Right.
he graduated from Allen, and
Right.
I was. It turns out that a good friend of mine was his English teacher at Allen, and the Friday before he was killed, he picked up the phone, or he emailed her, I think, and said, "I think I'm ready to do a book. I've got 200 something pages," and she said, "Okay." She said, and she gave him, her name is Charlene Spearin, and she gave him her home address, because it was summer. And she said, "Send me the book, and we'll see what we can do. Let me help you edit it." And she never got it. But in interviewing people who knew him, he was well known in Columbia. He would go to this open mic kind of thing called Mind Gravy. And Al Black, who's a friend of mine, was sort of the organizer of that, and he said he'd skateboard down to the event somewhere. Of course, Alan's in Columbia. This is somewhere in downtown Columbia, and he very tall, big smile. Everyone always talked about his smile, and he'd kind of stand in the back, and he was very sort of quiet and kind of humble. And Al would say, "Hey, Tawanza, you got a poem for us?" And he was good enough to be featured, which means he'd have a whole night that featured him. I've heard that his work. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to read his work, although a number of us have sort of reached out and would like to help put a book together. But Al said to me, he was sort of like a '60s poet. In other words, he would write about sort of racial, social justice issues, but he always was looking for a peaceful outcome.
Okay.
But by all accounts, just a beautiful young man who tried to save his aunt Susie.
Yes, right.
And I always remember Felicia
Sanders.
saying, his mother saying, I think she said at the bond hearing, "He's my hero." And I didn't know what that meant until I read later that he tried to save his aunt.
Right.
So what a loss,
Quickly, describe to me the following one word: Ethel. Ethel.
Well, she cared for the building.
That's
For the
right.
building.
She was the custodian of the building, and in the book we interviewed the man who was the custodian before Mr. Black, And he tried to, if I remember correctly, he tried to get her daughter, Ethel Lance's daughter, to do the work.
Right.
But I think her daughter didn't want to do it, and Ethel Lance stepped in and did the work. But more importantly, for a person who had to care for the building, she cared for the people in the building as well. And she most importantly, she cared for the people who were doing events.
Yeah.
Because it was a custodian's job to lock up, secure the building after an event.
Right.
But she would stay and she would participate or attend the events, and then she would leave. And then when people would leave, then she would secure the event, the building, and then she would go home. But also she cared for, she was a custodian and well respected and well loved at the Gilliard Municipal Auditorium, where she worked for a number of years. And of course, the Gilliard, within the context of the community, is important because it was the construction of the Gilliard that started the process to not only change the face of Anson Borough, but also started that process that is continuing today, that is changing the landscape in the peninsula of Charleston. So, but Ethel Lance, even though Charleston has changed, I believe she still lived right there on Alexander Street. Okay. She was, the changes that came about with the construction of the Gilliard and other changes did not push her family out of the community. They stayed in the community, so they were very well rooted in not only the church, but also the community.
Sharonda, in one word. Coleman Singleton.
Yeah.
Chris Singleton's mother.
I think what a great athlete she was as well. I mean, I ran track,
right.
And I know we did actually say she was a hurdler and a beloved coach, and just, you know, when you look at those kids, Chris, of course, in particular, but the two daughters, right? What an amazing mom. I mean, it just their ability, his ability to take care of his sisters. I mean, I know they've had to move away and whatnot, but also to just think, you know what, I got to keep my head on here. I got to stick with it. Finish school the way my mom would, and I know they're naming a building in her honor. But I think that just his attitude, it says everything about her. What an amazing woman, and you know, we found out that if he hadn't had a baseball game that night, he probably would have been with her. And you know, he did not offer forgiveness at the bond hearing. It was sort of a couple days later. I think he was actually in front of the church, and you know, immediately said that's what she would want me to do. So, and I believe she was from Hollywood. I'm pretty sure. Was it? No,
that was DePayne was from Hollywood.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's right. But anyway, just amazing, amazing woman who just gave. I mean, she was a mom, a single mom, a you know, all that she gave. Her life's work was really involved taking care of and helping young people.
Speaking of which, describe to me the following one word: Daniel, Myra, Susie DePayne.
Wait, say that again.
Daniel, Myra, Susie DePayne.
Well, Daniel, Myra, those are three different people. Daniel, Myra.
That's four different people.
Daniel, yeah. Well, I would say, DePayne, we mentioned her. She was from Hollywood.
That's right.
She was a minister, of course.
Right.
She grew up in an AME family. But it was initially ordained, if that's the correct word, as a Baptist minister, correct. But then she came back to the AME denomination, which was her family church. And I believe she was received one of the two or three who received her license. She received her license and was coming back into the church. And of course, you know, she was one of 4 members of the ministerial staff that was lost that night. But DePayne was started, you know, preaching early. And people recognized that she had a calling,
Right.
that she had a voice, and she had something to say. And I interviewed someone who knew her when in her early life, who remembered her fondly, and her family, of course, was there at the church that day when she delivered the sermon in her hometown. As you know, Hollywood is a very close-knit community, and many people, I think even today, are still grieving her loss.
I think they have a little memorial garden they've set
Yes.
up. That I
Yeah, I
haven't
remember.
seen it, but I've seen footage. It's lovely, very
Yeah.
peaceful.
And then think about Dr. Quintin, Reverend Quintin Bingley. Some people say he could have been governor of South Carolina.
I think it had potential to
Even more, maybe a congressman.
Yeah,
senator,
national,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, he was so young.
Yes, he was.
Knew he was going to go.
Far from life. Well, Herb Frazier, Poet Marjory Wentworth, and Dr. Bernard Powers, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for
Thanks
the
for having us.
opportunity.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.